The flashing red and blue lights in the rearview mirror usually mean a minor inconvenience. But for Sergeant First Class Terence Collins, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would test every ounce of his military discipline. He had survived hostile war zones and grueling deployments, but nothing could have prepared him for the blatant disrespect and targeted humiliation from two rogue cops on a lonely North Carolina highway. They thought he was just another easy target. They mocked his uniform, his skin, and his service. What those officers didn't know was that Terence wasn't alone, and a heavily armed convoy of military police was already speeding down the asphalt to deliver a brutal, unforgettable dose of instant karma. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Highway 87, a long, heat-warped stretch of asphalt winding its way toward Fayetteville, North Carolina. The humidity hung in the air like a wet wool blanket, clinging to the pine trees that lined the desolate road. Inside his meticulously maintained 2018 Honda Accord, Sergeant First Class Terence Collins enjoyed the blasts of cold air from his AC vents. He was still in his operational camouflage pattern uniform, his OCPs. The numb tape over his right breast pocket read Collins in stark black lettering mirroring the UA, as army tape on his left. Terence was a man of quiet dignity. At 32, his face bore the subtle, hardened lines of 3 combat deployments and countless sleepless nights. He was a combat engineer, a man who cleared paths through minefields and built infrastructure in the most dangerous corners of the globe. Today, however, his mission was simple: drive back to his off-base apartment, strip out of his sweaty uniform, and sleep for 12 uninterrupted hours. He had just wrapped up a grueling 72-hour training exercise at Fort Liberty, his muscles aching with that deep, familiar fatigue that only soldiers truly understand. The radio played low, a classic soul station murmuring in the background, offering a stark contrast to the explosive drills he'd orchestrated over the weekend. He was driving exactly the speed limit, 55 miles per hour, as an active-duty serviceman and a black man driving in a rural southern county. Terence never gave anyone a reason to look at him twice. He kept his tags updated, his blinkers functional, and his footlight on the pedal. But as he crested a small hill near the county line, the unmistakable blare of a police cruiser caught his eye from a hidden dirt turnoff. Inside the cruiser sat Officer Mitchell Hayes and Officer Robert Jenkins of the local county sheriff's department. Hayes was a rookie, a 24-year-old with a high and tight haircut, a chip on his shoulder the size of an anvil, and a reputation for escalating minor infractions into major confrontations. He was the kind of cop who viewed the public not as citizens to protect, but as enemy combatants in a war only he was fighting. Jenkins, his training officer, was in his late 50s. Jenkins was counting down the days to his pension, deeply complacent and too tired to rein in his aggressive partner. Worse, Jenkins harbored old, quiet prejudices that he allowed to manifest through the actions of the young, hot-headed Hayes. As Terence's Honda passed their hiding spot, Hayes squinted through the windshield. "Look at this guy," Hayes muttered, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. Tinted windows, riding a little low in the back, probably hauling something he shouldn't be. Hot. And so, Windows look legal to me, Mitch, Jenkins said, stifling a yawn and sipping from a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee. Just let him go. We're 10 minutes from shift change. Nah, Hayes said, throwing the cruiser into drive and kicking up a cloud of red Carolina clay as he pulled onto the highway. He crossed the solid white line. I saw it. Failure to maintain lane. I'm going to run his plates. Let's see what we've got. Terence watched in his rearview mirror as the cruiser closed the distance with terrifying speed, sitting practically on his bumper. He maintained his speed, his heart rate remaining steady. He hadn't swerved. He knew he hadn't. He kept his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, his mind automatically shifting into the protocol his father had taught him decades ago. a protocol reinforced by the realities of the world. Suddenly, the cruiser's light bar erupted into a blinding frenzy of red and blue, accompanied by a sharp, authoritative chirp of the siren. Terence sighed softly, a heavy, tired exhalation. He activated his right turn signal, slowly decelerating, and pulled his car onto the wide gravel shoulder of the highway, ensuring he left plenty of room for the officers to walk safely. He shifted into park, turned off the engine, rolled down all 4 of his windows, and placed both hands firmly on the top of the steering wheel. He did not reach for his wallet. He did not reach for his registration. He sat perfectly still, waiting. In the cruiser, Hayes ran the plates. Clean, no warrants. Registered to a Terence Collins. "Told you, jolted you," Jenkins grumbled. "Just write a warning and let's get out of this heat." "Let me do the talking, Bob," Hayes said, adjusting his duty belt, making sure his hand rested casually but prominently near the grip of his sidearm. He pushed open the door and stepped out into the oppressive heat, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. Jenkins followed slowly, walking around to the passenger side of Terence's vehicle, standing near the rear quarter panel with his thumbs hooked into his belt. Hayes approached the driver's side window. He didn't bend down to meet Terence eye to eye. Instead, he stood tall, forcing Terence to look up at him, an old intimidation tactic. "Do you know why I pulled you over today, boy?" Hayes asked, his voice dripping with an unearned authority and a subtle, venomous drawl. Terence's jaw tightened imperceptibly at the word boy. It was a deliberate choice of words, a loaded term that carried centuries of historical weight and disrespect. But Terence was a professional. He pushed his anger down, locking it behind a wall of military discipline. "No, officer, I do not," Terence replied clearly, his voice deep and calm. "I was maintaining the speed limit. You were swerving back there." Crossing the solid white, Hayes lied smoothly. He leaned in slightly, his eyes scanning the interior of the car, finally landing on Terence's uniform. A smirk tugged at the corner of Hayes's mouth. "License, registration, and proof of insurance." "My wallet is in my right back pocket, officer." "My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment," Terence stated evenly. "I am going to reach for them now." "Move slow," Hayes commanded, his hand tightening over his holster. Terence reached back, retrieved his wallet, and extracted his driver's license alongside his green military identification card. He handed both to Hayes. Hayes looked at the driver's license, then squinted at the military ID. He flicked it over, rubbed his thumb across the plastic, and then let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Sergeant First Class, huh?" Hayes sneered, looking Terence up and down. "You expect me to believe that? You look a little young, and a little too unpolished to be a senior, non-commissioned officer." Terence stared straight ahead. "I assure you, officer, the ID is valid. I am stationed at Fort Liberty. I'm just heading home from a field exercise." Hayes tossed the military ID back through the window. It hit Terence's chest and fell onto his lap. "I didn't ask for a life story. Hand me the registration." Terence slowly leaned over, popped the glove box, and handed over the paperwork. Jenkins, watching from the passenger's side, shifted uncomfortably. Even to his jaded eyes, Hayes was pushing the envelope. But the unwritten code of the badge kept Jenkins silent. He wasn't about to undermine his partner in front of a civilian, regardless of the civilian's uniform. "Hang tight, Sergeant," Hayes said, putting air quotes around the rank. He turned on his heel and marched back to the cruiser. Terence closed his eyes for a brief second. The sheer indignity of it was exhausting. He had men under his command who trusted him with their lives. He had defused roadside bombs in Helmand Province while taking small arms fire. Yet here, on a dusty road in his own country, he was being treated like a common criminal by a man who looked like he'd barely graduated high school. Minutes ticked by. The heat inside the Honda became stifling without the air conditioning, but Terence didn't dare turn the key to turn the fans back on. He knew how easily a sudden movement could be misinterpreted or willfully misconstrued, by an officer looking for an excuse. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, rolling down his temples and soaking into the collar of his uniform. Back in the cruiser, Hayes was agitated. He had run Terrence's license through the local, state, and federal databases. Nothing. Not a parking ticket, not a late registration. Terrence Collins was a ghost of good behavior. "He's clean, Mitch, crystal clean," Jenkins said, tapping the dashboard monitor. "Write the warning for failure, to maintain lane, and let's go." "I'm starving. I don't like his attitude," Hayes snapped, staring daggers at the back of Terrence's head. "He's sitting there in that uniform, thinking he's better than us. Thinking he's untouchable. You see a lot of guys buying surplus gear, trying to get discounts at the hardware store, trying to play hero. I bet that ID is a fake. Mitch, you're reaching. Fort Liberty is right down the road. Half the town is military. It's not stolen valor. He's just a soldier going home. I'm going to make sure," Hayes said, his ego overriding any sense of logic or procedure. He grabbed his radio and stepped out of the cruiser again, his posture stiff, projecting aggression. Terrence saw Hayes approaching in the side mirror. The officer's stride was purposeful, predatory. Jenkins followed, this time stepping slightly closer to the vehicle, his hand resting on his taser. "Step out of the vehicle," Hayes ordered loudly as he reached the window. Terrence didn't move immediately. "Officer, for what reason?" "I've provided my documentation." "I said step out of the damn car," Hayes barked, his voice cracking slightly with faux authority. "This is a lawful order. You are refusing to comply." "I am complying," Terrence said, his voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood his system. "I am stepping out of the vehicle." Terrence slowly opened the door. He swung his boots out onto the gravel and stood up to his full height. At 6'2", he possessed a commanding physical presence, broad-shouldered and muscular from years of rigorous physical training. He towered over Hayes by a good 3 inches. Hayes immediately took a half step back, his hand dropping to his service weapon. "Turn around, face the car. Hands behind your back." "Am I under arrest?" Terrence asked, turning slowly and placing his hands behind his back, interlacing his fingers as he had been trained. "You're being detained," Hayes said, stepping in close. He grabbed Terrence's wrists roughly, yanking them upward, a deliberate move designed to cause pain in the shoulders. Terrence grunted, but didn't resist. He felt the cold, hard steel of handcuffs click and tighten aggressively around his wrists, biting into his skin. "Mitch, is this really necessary?" Jenkins murmured from a few feet away, glancing nervously up and down the empty highway. "Officer Safety Bob," Hayes replied, his voice dripping with condescension. He pushed Terrence forward, slamming the soldier's chest and face into the hot metal roof of the Honda. The heat of the metal burned through Terrence's uniform, but the physical pain was secondary to the searing humiliation. Cars were beginning to pass by. A minivan slowed down, the faces of young children pressed against the glass watching a U.S. Army sergeant being treated like a violent felon on the side of the road. Hayes began a rough, invasive pat-down, kicking Terrence's legs wider apart. "You military boys think you own this town," Hayes sneered close to Terrence's ear. "You walk around in these pajamas playing war, acting like you demand respect. Well, out here on this highway, my badge outranks your little patches." Terrence pressed his cheek against the hot roof, taking slow, measured breaths. "Maintain military bearing," he repeated in his head. "Do not give them a reason. Survive the encounter." "My military ID is federally issued," Terrence said, his voice muffled against the car. "If you believe it's fake, you are obligated to contact the military police at Fort Liberty to verify my identity. You do not have the jurisdiction to arbitrarily detain active duty personnel without probable cause." "Oh, listen to the barracks lawyer," Hayes laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He pulled Terrence back from the car by the chain of the handcuffs, spinning him around. "I don't need to call anybody, boy. I am the law out here. And right now I'm investigating you for fraudulent identification and resisting a lawful detention." "We wasn't resisting, Mitch. Jenkins interjected, finally stepping forward. "Let's just cool it down. We've patted him down. No weapons. Let's take the cuffs off." "Back off, Bob." Unhandling this, Hayes snapped, his face flushed red with adrenaline and power. He looked back at Terence. "Go sit on the curb." "Now." Hayes shoved Terence toward the grassy, trash-littered ditch on the side of the highway. With his hands secured behind his back, Terence stumbled awkwardly, struggling to maintain his balance. He managed to drop to his knees and then sit on the dusty ground, the dry grass scratching at his neck. He sat there, a decorated combat veteran, shackled in the dirt while a rookie cop on a power trip stood over him, grinning. Hayes strutted back and forth, seemingly basking in his absolute control over a man who, in any other circumstance, he wouldn't dare cross. "We're going to search the car," Hayes announced loudly to Jenkins, ensuring Terence could hear. With an attitude like his, he's definitely hiding contraband. "You do not have my consent to search my vehicle," Terence stated clearly from the ditch. "There is no probable cause." "I smell marijuana," Hayes lied effortlessly, looking directly at Jenkins, daring the older cop to contradict him. "That gives me probable cause." "Come on, Bob. Let's tear this thing apart." As Hayes turned his back to begin rummaging through the meticulously clean interior of the Honda, throwing Terence's gear and paperwork onto the floorboards, a quiet electronic voice spoke from the vehicle. It was faint at first, but Terence heard it, and he knew exactly what it meant. What Officers Hayes and Jenkins did not know, and could not possibly have anticipated, was the specific technological setup inside Terence's car. 20 minutes before the flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror, Terence had received a phone call. It was routed through his Honda's Bluetooth system. The caller was Captain Gregory Hughes, the Provost Marshal of Fort Liberty, essentially the chief of police for the entire military installation. Captain Hughes and Terence had served together in Afghanistan. They were close friends and professional colleagues. Hughes had called to discuss the logistics of an upcoming security detail for a visiting general. When Terence saw the police lights, he hadn't ended the call. He had simply tapped the mute button on his steering wheel. The line had remained open, a silent digital witness to the entire harrowing ordeal. For the past 15 minutes, Captain Hughes had been sitting at his desk in the military police headquarters on base, a headset pressed to his ear. Initially, he thought Terence had just been pulled over for a routine check and was keeping the line open as a precaution. But as the audio fed directly into his ears, the aggressive commands, the racial undertones of the word boy, the sound of Terence being slammed against the car, the blatant lie about smelling marijuana, and the dismissal of Terence's federally issued ID, Hughes' blood boiled. He recognized the sound of an illegal detention. He recognized the sound of rogue officers abusing their authority. Most importantly, he recognized that one of his most decorated NCOs was in immediate, unpredictable danger at the hands of local law enforcement. From his desk, Captain Hughes hadn't just listened. He had acted. "Dispatch, this is PM Hughes," he had barked into a secondary radio while listening to Hayes rough up Terence. "I have an active duty soldier, Sergeant First Class Terence Collins, currently undergoing an unlawful detention and possible assault under color of authority by county deputies on Highway 87, approximately 5 miles from the southern gate. I have an open audio line. The officers are escalating." "Copy, Captain," the military dispatch had replied immediately. "What are your orders?" "Scramble the QRF," Hughes ordered, his voice cold and deadly serious, referring to the quick reaction force of military police always on standby. "I want 3 MP cruisers out there now. I want lights and sirens. I am leaving my office and taking point. Nobody, and I mean nobody, touches my soldiers." Back on the dusty shoulder of Highway 87, Terence sat in the dirt, the metal cuffs cutting off the circulation to his hands. He watched impassively as Hayes practically climbed into the back seat of his Honda, tossing a gym bag onto the gravel, unzipping it and dumping out Terence's running shoes, gym clothes, and shaving kit. Jenkins stood by the cruiser, nervously adjusting his sunglasses. He looked at his watch. Shift change had already passed. He wanted to be anywhere but here. "Nothing in the back, Mitch?" Jenkins called out, his voice tight. "Let's wrap this up." "Seriously." "Shut up, Bob." Hayes's muffled voice came from inside the car. He popped the trunk from the inside. He walked around to the back, pulling out Terrence's heavy military duffel bag. "Look at all this crap. Bet there's some stolen government property in here." "That is my issued field gear," Terrence said calmly from the ditch. "I'm warning you, officer, you are crossing a severe legal line. I thought I told you to keep your mouth shut." Hayes yelled, taking a step toward Terrence, his hand balling into a fist. Before Hayes could take another step, a sound cut through the heavy, humid air. It was faint at first, like the distant whine of a mosquito. But it was growing louder rapidly, a high-pitched, dual-tone wail that echoed off the pine trees. It wasn't the standard siren of the local county sheriff or the highway patrol. It was a deeper, more aggressive wail, the distinct sound of federal law enforcement vehicles pushing their engines to the absolute limit. Hayes stalked, his hand hovering over the duffel bag. He looked down the highway toward the direction of the military base. "You hear that, Bob?" Hayes asked, a flicker of confusion crossing his arrogant features. Jenkins turned around, shielding his eyes from the sun. The wail was growing deafening. "Sounds like a lot of units." "Did you call for backup?" Hayes asked, sudden panic edging into his voice. "No," Jenkins said, his stomach dropping. "I thought you did." "I didn't call anyone," Hayes stammered, abandoning the duffel bag and walking quickly back toward the cruiser. Terrence shifted his weight in the dirt, a slow, grim satisfaction settling over his features. The cavalry wasn't just coming, they were already here. Over the crest of the hill, practically flying over the asphalt, came a massive black, heavily armored SUV, its grille flashing with blinding red and blue strobe lights. Right behind it, running in a staggered tactical formation, were 3 pristine white military police Dodge Chargers, their light bars painting the trees in frantic colors. They weren't slowing down to observe. They were arriving with a terrifying, aggressive purpose. Hayes and Jenkins froze in their tracks. The roar of the approaching engines was earth-shaking. The black SUV slammed on its brakes, skidding slightly on the gravel shoulder, violently throwing up a massive cloud of dust that engulfed the sheriff's cruiser. The 3 MP Chargers boxed them in perfectly, one pulling directly in front of the cruiser, one blocking the rear, and the third angling itself sharply toward the center of the road, stopping all civilian traffic in both directions. The doors of the MP vehicles flew open simultaneously before the cars had even fully stopped rocking on their suspensions. Out poured 8 heavily armed military police officers, clad in full tactical gear, Kevlar vests, and carrying patrol rifles at the low ready. They moved with a terrifying synchronized precision that local cops could never hope to match. Leading the charge from the black SUV was Captain Gregory Hughes. He didn't look like a man who was there to negotiate. His face was a mask of furious, absolute authority. "Military police, federal jurisdiction. Step away from the soldier, keep your hands away from your weapons, and step back from the vehicle immediately." Hughes roared, his voice carrying over the dying wail of the sirens. Officer Hayes, his face completely drained of color, his previous arrogance evaporating like water on a hot stove, slowly raised his hands. Beside him, Jenkins looked like he was about to pass out. The tables hadn't just turned, they had been flipped, shattered, and burned to the ground. The hunters had just become the prey. The silence that descended upon Highway 87 was heavier than the sweltering North Carolina humidity. The only sounds were the heavy, idling hum of the military police vehicles and the frantic, shallow breathing of Officer Mitchell Hayes. The swirling red and blue lights painted the surrounding pine trees in chaotic strobes, casting long, intimidating shadows of the tactical team that had just enveloped the scene. Captain Gregory Hughes stepped forward, the gravel crunching under his heavy combat boots. He was a veteran of Fallujah and Kandahar, a man who would stare down insurgents and warlords. The terrified rookie cop trembling before him didn't even register on his threat scale, but the anger radiating from the captain was palpable, a cold and focused fury. You don't have jurisdiction here, Hayes stammered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of the venomous drawl he had used on Terence just minutes prior. He took a shaky step backward, his hands still raised defensively. This is county property. This is my traffic stop. Jurisdiction? Captain Hughes repeated, his voice dangerously low, slicing through the tension like a razor blade. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. You illegally detained a United States soldier without probable cause, you physically assaulted him under color of authority, and you ignored his federally issued identification. You crossed out of county jurisdiction the second you decided to play God with one of my men. Hughes didn't take his eyes off Hayes, but he raised 2 fingers in a sharp, tactical gesture. Private First Class Wyatt. From the rear MP Charger, a young, intensely focused military policeman broke formation. Yes, sir. Get those cuffs off Sergeant First Class Collins. Immediately, Hughes ordered. Wait, you can't do that. Hayes protested, a desperate squeak escaping his throat. He instinctively moved his hand toward his belt, a reflexive, incredibly stupid decision. Before Hayes's fingers could even brush the leather of his holster, 3 MP rifles snapped out from the low, ready position. The distinct metallic clack of safeties being switched off echoed across the highway. Keep your hands exactly where I can see them, officer, Hughes warned, his eyes narrowing into deadly slits. If you so much as twitch toward that duty weapon, my men will consider it a lethal threat. Do we have an understanding? Jenkins, who had been completely paralyzed by shock, suddenly snapped to life. He aggressively grabbed Hayes by the shoulder and shoved him back. Are you out of your mind, Mitch? Put your hands on your head. Do it now. Jenkins practically screamed at his partner before raising his own hands high into the air. Captain, we are compliant. No weapons are being drawn. Private First Class William Wyatt didn't hesitate. He bypassed the 2 terrified local cops and jogged directly to the ditch where Terence was sitting. Wyatt dropped to one knee, retrieving a universal handcuff key from his tactical vest. Are you injured, Sergeant? Wyatt asked respectfully, his tone a stark contrast to the disrespect Terence had just endured. Just my pride, Wyatt, Terence replied quietly, offering a small, appreciative nod. And my shoulders. He clamped them on tight. We've got you, Sergeant. Sit tight, Wyatt said. He slipped the key into the mechanism, turning it with a practiced flick of the wrist. The ratchets disengaged, and the heavy metal cuffs fell away into the dirt. Terence brought his arms forward, wincing slightly as the blood rushed back into his numb hands. He rubbed his wrists where deep red indentations had already formed into bruised rings. He stood up slowly, dusting the dry Carolina clay off his OCP trousers. He didn't look at Hayes or Jenkins. He stood at the position of parade rest, his military bearing completely restored, projecting a silent, immovable dignity. Back on the asphalt, Hayes was hyperventilating. You can't just release my suspect. He was swerving. He refused a lawful order. I have it all on my dashcam. Captain Hughes let out a dark, humorless chuckle. He reached into one of the many pouches on his tactical vest and pulled out his smartphone, tapping the screen to bring up an active call log. I certainly hope your dashcam was rolling, Officer Hayes, Hughes said, stepping directly into Hayes's personal space, forcing the taller cop to look down into the unyielding eyes of the provost marshal. Because your dashcam is going to line up perfectly with the digital audio recording I currently have saved on Fort Liberty's secure servers. Hayes blinked, confusion momentarily overriding his terror. Audio recording. Man, thus art proud to translate You see, Hughes continued, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. When you pulled Sergeant Collins over, he was on a Bluetooth phone call with me. He muted his end to comply with your stop, but he didn't hang up. So, For the last 20 minutes I've been sitting at my desk, listening to every single word you said. All the blood drained from Hayes's face. He looked like a man who had just been handed his own death warrant. I heard you call a decorated non-commissioned officer boy, Hughes listed, stepping closer, forcing Hayes to back up against the side of his own cruiser. I heard you lie about him crossing the solid white line. I heard you fabricate the smell of marijuana to execute an illegal search of his vehicle. I heard you slam his face into the roof of his car after he offered zero resistance. You didn't just break department policy, officer. You committed multiple federal civil rights violations. Jenkins closed his eyes, a groan of absolute despair escaping his lips. He had known Hayes was out of control, but hearing it laid out like this, knowing the federal government had a pristine audio recording of the entire encounter, made him realize his own pension and possibly his freedom were now ashes in the wind. "Captain, please," Jenkins pleaded, his voice trembling. "I told him to back down. I tried to de-escalate." Hughes turned his icy gaze to Jenkins. "You stood by and watched your partner unlawfully detain and assault a citizen you are sworn to protect. Your badge is just as tarnished as his. Now, both of you are going to stand exactly where you are. If you move, my MPs will restrain you. I have just gotten off the phone with the FBI field office in Raleigh, and your sheriff is currently en route." The trap had closed. The predators were caught in a cage of their own making. 10 agonizing minutes passed. For Hayes, it felt like a decade. He stood pinned against his cruiser, sweating profusely, while Specialist Thomas Henderson and 2 other heavily armed MPs stood in a semicircle around him, their expressions completely unreadable behind their dark tactical sunglasses. Terence, meanwhile, was treated like visiting royalty. Private Wyatt and another MP carefully picked up all of Terence's scattered gear from the dust, shaking off the dirt, and neatly repacked his duffel bag and gym bag, placing them gently back into the trunk of the Honda. The wail of a new siren pierced the air, this one deeper, accompanied by the low rumble of a heavy-duty engine. A massive white Ford F-250 with the county sheriff's star emblazoned on the side came tearing down the highway, flanked by 2 more county cruisers. The truck slammed to a halt and Sheriff John Caldwell stepped out. Caldwell was a bear of a man in his late 60s, with a thick silver mustache, and a reputation for being an old-school, no-nonsense lawman. He had served in the Marines in his youth, and he maintained a strict, rigid discipline within his department. Or so he thought. Caldwell took one look at the scene. His deputies boxed in by federal military police, a black soldier standing by with bruised wrists, and a furious army captain waiting for him, and his face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. "Captain Hughes," Sheriff Caldwell called out, his boots striking the pavement with heavy, angry thuds as he approached. He extended a hand. "Sheriff Caldwell, what in God's name is happening on my highway?" Hughes shook the sheriff's hand firmly. "Sheriff, your deputies decided to go rogue. They executed an illegal traffic stop, unlawfully detained Sergeant First Class Collins, assaulted him, and attempted to illegally search his vehicle based on fabricated probable cause." "That's a lie," Hayes shrieked, his panic making him completely lose his mind. "Sheriff, he's lying!" The soldier was belligerent. He was resisting. "They're covering for him because he's military." Caldwell turned to Hayes, his eyes blazing. "Shut your mouth, Mitchell, before I wire it shut myself. You will speak when spoken to." Caldwell turned back to Hughes. "Captain, those are heavy accusations. I need proof." "I was hoping you'd say that," Hughes replied. He signaled to one of his men who jogged over and handed Hughes a ruggedized field tablet. Hughes synced with his phone, turned the volume up to maximum, and pressed play. The clear, high-definition audio from Terence's Bluetooth microphone filled the highway. Sheriff Caldwell stood in stony silence as he listened. He heard the swagger in Hayes's voice. He heard the undeniable racial dog whistle of the word boy. He heard Terence's calm, perfectly respectful compliance. He heard the violent thud of Terrence being slammed against the car, and he heard Hayes openly admit to faking the smell of marijuana to bypass the Fourth Amendment. With every passing second of the recording, Hayes seemed to shrink physically. He looked at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Jenkins just stared blankly ahead, a single bead of sweat rolling down his nose. Knowing it was over, the recording ended. The silence returned, thicker and more suffocating than before. Sheriff Caldwell slowly took off his Stetson hat, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. When he looked back up at Hayes, there was no anger left in his eyes. There was only pure, unadulterated disgust. "Mitchell," Caldwell said, his voice terrifyingly quiet, "take off your gun belt." Hayes's head snapped up. Tears were welling in his eyes. "Sheriff, please. I made a mistake. I got overzealous. I thought he was—" "Take it off," Caldwell barked, a sudden explosive command that made even the MPs flinch. "Right now, and hand me your badge." Trembling violently, Hayes unbuckled his duty belt. The heavy leather, weighed down by his sidearm, taser, and cuffs, fell to the asphalt with a dull thud. His hand shook so badly he could barely unpin the silver star from his chest. He held it out to the sheriff, sobbing quietly. Caldwell snatched the badge from his hand. "You are stripped of your police powers, effective immediately. You are a disgrace to this uniform, to this county, and to the oath you swore." Caldwell turned to Jenkins. "And you, Bob, you stood there and let this punk play cowboy with the man's constitutional rights. You're suspended without pay pending an internal affairs investigation. Hand over your belt and badge." Jenkins didn't argue. He nodded slowly, unbuckled his belt, and handed over his badge. "Yes, Sheriff. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize to me," Caldwell sneered. He turned around, walking past the humiliated ex-officers, and approached Terrence. Sheriff Caldwell stopped 3 feet from Terrence. He squared his shoulders, stood at attention, and delivered a crisp, formal salute. Terrence, slightly surprised, returned the salute flawlessly. "Sergeant Collins," Caldwell said, his voice carrying clearly over the idling engines. "On behalf of the county, and on behalf of every decent law enforcement officer who wears a badge, I offer you my most sincere and profound apologies. What happened to you today was an abomination. It was cowardly, it was racist, and it was illegal. I promise you I will personally see to it that the district attorney presses civil rights charges against Mitchell Hayes to the absolute fullest extent of the law." "Noku. Thank you, Sheriff," Terrence replied, his voice calm, projecting the quiet strength of a man who had won without throwing a single punch. "I appreciate your swift action." Captain Hughes walked up to stand beside Terrence. "We'll be following up with the FBI, Sheriff. The military takes the harassment of its personnel very seriously." "I expect nothing less, Captain." "I'll hand over the dashcam footage to the feds myself," Caldwell assured him. He gestured to the 2 remaining county cruisers. "My deputies will transport these 2 civilians back to the station. Sergeant Collins, you are free to go, and thank you for your service." "Let's get you home, Terrence," Hughes said, patting his friend on the shoulder. "Yes, sir," Terrence said. He walked toward his Honda. As Terrence opened his car door, he paused and looked back. Mitchell Hayes, stripped of his gun, his badge, and his unearned authority, was being roughly shoved into the back of a county cruiser by another deputy. The arrogant, untouchable cop was now just a terrified civilian, crying in the back of a police car, his career and future destroyed in exactly 15 minutes of pure, unfiltered karma. Terrence slid into the driver's seat. He turned the key. The engine purred to life, and the AC finally kicked back in, washing over him with a wave of cool relief. As he pulled back onto Highway 87, flanked by an escort of 3 military police chargers, he looked in his rearview mirror one last time. The flashing lights were still there. But this time, they weren't a threat. They were a shield. The transition from an untouchable predator to a caged suspect is a jarring, violent psychological drop. For former Officer Mitchell Hayes, that drop occurred the moment the heavy steel door of the Cumberland County Sheriff's holding cell slammed shut, the echo ringing in his ears like a funeral bell. He sat on a cold stainless steel bench, shivering in his undershirt. His badge, his gun, his authority, everything that had inflated his hollow ego was gone, sitting in an evidence locker down the hall. The knuckle fallout was instantaneous, but the true nightmare for Hayes was just beginning to cross county lines. Because Terence Collins was an active duty soldier on federal orders, the jurisdiction didn't remain solely with the local sheriff. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been notified the second Captain Hughes ended his call on the highway. Within 48 hours, the case landed on the desk of Cumberland County's actual, real-life district attorney, Billy West. D.A. West, known for his relentless prosecution of corruption and his deep ties to the Fort Liberty military community, took one listen to the unredacted audio recording and immediately coordinated with the Department of Justice. West wasn't just going to hit Hayes with a simple assault charge, he was going for the throat. 2 days after the highway incident, Hayes was transferred to an interrogation room that smelled intensely of bleach and stale coffee. He sat across from his union-appointed attorney, a weary-looking man who kept rubbing his temples. Across the table sat D.A. Billy West and 2 stern-faced FBI special agents. "Mr. Hayes," D.A. West began, his voice calm but layered with unmistakable severity. "We are not here to negotiate a minor slap on the wrist. I have reviewed the dashcam footage and the FBI has forensically authenticated the audio recording provided by the Provost Marshal at Fort Liberty. You are looking at a multi-count federal indictment for violating 18 U.S.C. SAO. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, alongside state charges of false imprisonment, assault, and filing a false police report." Hayes swallowed hard, his throat dry. "It was a mistake. I thought I smelled contraband. I was just doing my job." "Your job," one of the FBI agents interrupted, slamming a thick manila folder onto the table, "does not involve manufacturing probable cause to terrorize a decorated combat veteran. And unfortunately for you, Mitchell, this wasn't an isolated mistake. The twist that Hayes hadn't anticipated was the cowardice of his former partner. The moment Robert Jenkins had been suspended and faced losing his pension he had spent 25 years securing, he immediately rolled over. Jenkins had cut a plea deal with D.A. West that morning. In exchange for immunity from federal prosecution and the recommendation for a lighter state sentence, Jenkins handed the investigators everything they needed to completely bury Hayes. Mr. Might. Jenkins was remarkably cooperative. D.A. West continued, opening the folder to reveal printed transcripts of text messages. He detailed a systemic pattern of behavior. He provided us with access to your private squad car communications and a group chat you maintained with other junior deputies. A chat where you routinely bragged about targeting minority motorists, inventing traffic violations, and conducting illegal searches. Hayes felt the blood drain from his face, his stomach plunging into an icy abyss. The group chat. He had deleted it, but he had forgotten that digital footprints never truly vanish, especially when the FBI comes knocking. "We also executed a search warrant on your locker and your residence this morning," the FBI agent added, his eyes locked onto Hayes's terrified face. "We found an assortment of undocumented cash, a few pieces of jewelry, and a collection of military challenge coins that did not belong to you. Trophies, Mr. Hayes. Stolen from the motorists you illegally shoved down when you thought their cameras weren't rolling." Hayes looked at his lawyer, his eyes wide with desperate panic. "Do something. They can't do this." His lawyer slowly closed his notepad. He looked at Hayes, not with sympathy but with profound professional disgust. "Mitchell, given the evidence presented, the audio, the dash cam, the testimony of your partner, and the recovered stolen property, my official legal advice is that you prepare yourself for a very long stay in a federal penitentiary. There is no defense here. You are completely exposed." The walls of the interrogation room seemed to shrink, closing in on Hayes. The reality of his situation finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his arrogance. He wasn't the law anymore. He was just a criminal who had finally picked the wrong target. He put his face in his hands and began to weep, the pathetic, gasping sobs echoing off the cinder-block walls. Meanwhile, Sergeant First Class Terence Collins was back at Fort Liberty, standing in front of his commanding officer. He was not reprimanded. He was commended. The military community rallied around him. The audio of the stop had been kept strictly confidential by the military and the DA's office to protect the integrity of the trial, but word had spread through the ranks. Terence became a quiet legend on base, the soldier who maintained perfect military bearing and let an arrogant cop hang himself with his own rope. 8 months later, the sweltering heat of the North Carolina summer had given way to the brisk, biting chill of a February morning. The imposing granite facade of the Terry Sanford Federal Building and United States Courthouse loomed over the city. Inside courtroom 3A, the air was thick with anticipation. Mitchell Hayes sat at the defense table. The physical transformation was staggering. Gone was the swaggering, broad-shouldered bully who had patrolled Highway 87. He had lost weight, his skin was pale, and he was dressed in a drab, ill-fitting beige prison jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to a chain around his waist. The very same type of metal cuffs he had so gleefully clamped onto Terence's wrists now bound his own. The gallery was packed. Half the room was filled with military personnel in crisp dress uniforms there to support Terence. The other half was filled with local civil rights activists and disgusted citizens who had followed the high-profile case. Judge Eleanor Vance, a formidable jurist known for her zero-tolerance policy regarding police corruption, presided over the sentencing hearing. Hayes had pled guilty a month prior, realizing that going to trial against the mountain of evidence, including Jenkins' damning testimony, would have resulted in a maximum sentence. He was throwing himself at the mercy of the court. When it was time for the victim impact statement, Terence Collins stood up from the front row. He was dressed in his Army service uniform, the dark blue fabric immaculate, his chest adorned with rows of ribbons denoting his tours of duty, his valor, and his unwavering service to his country. As he walked past the defense table, he didn't even look at Hayes. He approached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," Terence began, his deep, resonant voice filling the silent courtroom. "On the day I was pulled over, I was not treated like a citizen nor a soldier. I was treated like an animal, Mr. Amos." Hayes used his badge not as a shield to protect the public, but as a weapon to enforce his own bigotry and insecurities. Terence paused, his posture perfectly straight, projecting the same unyielding strength he had shown on the highway. "I have spent my adult life defending the Constitution of the United States," Terence continued. "I have lost brothers in arms fighting for the freedoms that document guarantees. To come home and have those very freedoms stripped away on a dusty road by a man sworn to uphold them is a betrayal I cannot easily articulate. Mr. Hayes thought he had the power to break my dignity. He failed, but he shattered the trust between law enforcement and the community. I ask the court to impose a sentence that reflects the severity of that betrayal." "Thank you, Your Honor." Terence stepped down and returned to his seat, surrounded by the supportive nods of his fellow soldiers. Hayes's attorney made a desperate, hollow plea for leniency, citing Hayes's youth and inexperience. But when Judge Vance leaned into her microphone, her expression was etched with cold, judicial fury. "Mr. Hayes," the judge began, her voice echoing loudly, "I have sat on this bench for 22 years. I have seen every manner of criminal behavior, but crimes committed by those who wear a badge are uniquely insidious. You took an oath. You were given the power of the state, the authority to deprive citizens of their liberty, and you used it to terrorize a decorated servant of this nation because of the color of his skin and the uniform on his back." Hayes kept his head bowed, his eyes glued to the scuffed wooden table in front of him. "The audio recording of your conduct was one of the most disgraceful things I have ever heard in a court of law," Judge Vance stated flatly. "You mocked his service. You physically assaulted an entirely compliant man. You fabricated evidence to justify an illegal search. And as the subsequent investigation proved, this was not an isolated incident. You were running a personal racist fiefdom out of your cruiser. The judge picked up her gavel, Mitchell Hayes, for the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, and the subsequent federal charges of civil rights violations. I sentence you to 108 months in a federal penitentiary, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from ever holding any position in law enforcement, security, or public office. A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. 9 years in federal prison. It was a devastating, career-ending, life-altering sentence. A hard, undeniable dose of absolute karma. As the bailiff stepped forward to escort Hayes away, he finally looked up. He turned his head and locked eyes with Terence one last time. Hayes' eyes were hollow, filled with regret and the terrifying realization of the decade of confinement ahead of him. Terence simply held his gaze. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just watched the broken man be led away in chains, his own military bearing flawless. Robert Jenkins fared slightly better, but his life was irrevocably changed. Thanks to his plea deal, he avoided federal prison time, receiving 5 years of strict probation. However, DA Billy West and Sheriff Caldwell ensured he was permanently stripped of his law enforcement certification. He lost his coveted pension, forced to take a job as a night shift security guard at a local strip mall, his reputation utterly destroyed in the town he had lived in his entire life. A year later, the harsh summer sun once again beat down on Highway 87. Terence Collins, now promoted to Master Sergeant, drove his meticulously clean Honda Accord down the exact same stretch of asphalt. The radio played a smooth soul track. He was heading home after another grueling training cycle. He drove exactly 55 miles per hour. As he passed the dirt turnoff where his nightmare had begun, he noticed a local county sheriff's cruiser parked in the shade. The deputy inside didn't rev his engine. He didn't pull out aggressively. As Terence drove past, the deputy simply raised a hand, offering a polite, respectful wave to the soldier passing by. Terence gave a small nod in return, keeping his hands at 10 and 2. He drove on toward home, the road ahead clear, the ghosts of the past finally left behind in the dust. Justice had not only been served, it had reshaped the very road he drove on. If you felt the incredible satisfaction of instant karma in this story, make sure to hit that like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Had you ever witnessed someone abusing their power only to get exactly what they deserve? We want to hear your stories. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family to spread this amazing tale of justice. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our daily dramatic stories of revenge, karma, and real-life justice. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.